Okay, well, so Steve and I will speak for about 45 minutes to an hour, and he will continue with his uplifting thesis, and I will try to terrify and depress you. I'm only partly joking. So, Steve, I want to reiterate what you said at the end there about what you're not saying. You're not saying that there's some magical force that's pulling us toward a better future. There's nothing built into the system that guarantees this can't run off the rails spectacularly, right?
That's right.
And this is something you're often charged with. I mean, that it's just there's some kind of teleology or something pushing from behind that is just all to the good.
Yeah. No, and no matter how many times I explicitly say that is not what any of this means, as I said, intellectual culture can't wrap its mind around the concept of progress. They constantly regress to the idea of some mystical force, some arc of justice that carries us ever upward, whereas the idea is not really all that exotic. Namely, we try to understand the world, we value human well-being, we think up ways to improve human well-being, and we sometimes succeed. And if we remember what works, if we abandon what didn't work, there can be cumulative improvements. Nothing mystical about that.
Yeah. So let's start with the concept that you lay out very clearly in your book, which is the notion of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics. Tell us what that is, because this has many implications for your thesis.
Yes, so one thing I did not mention in this particular talk, in the interest of time, was some of the insights that science provides about the human condition. The idea that science is just a source of useful gadgets, but that we have to look to religion, to mysticism for our fundamental understanding of who we are, I think is wrong. I think there are some major discoveries of science that are highly relevant to understanding our predicament. One of them being entropy, the fact that in a closed system without input of energy, things fall apart, disorder increases, stuff happens. And that's just because there are vastly more ways for things to go wrong than for things to go right.
Right.
And one implication is that a lot of advances in human well-being, that is, local bits of order that suit our needs, that make us healthy and happy and comfortable, require inputs of energy that, left to their own devices, things will collapse. Another is that we should recalibrate what we think of as the baseline of human existence. I think we're so used to the fruits of human progress that it's easy to think that the natural state of affairs is universal prosperity and harmony and equality, and any deviation from it is a raging injustice for which we have to identify a villain. An understanding of entropy and evolution, that being another discovery of science with major implications for the human condition, suggests that no, left to our own devices, we kind of live in squalor and chaos and disorder and misery, that we should be appreciative of the human accomplishments that have lifted us out of that state. We should, of course, still recognize the problems that occur, but we shouldn't assume that things go well all by themselves. The universe doesn't work that way.
So yeah, you say in the book that poverty doesn't need an explanation, wealth does. Right? So
that's a quote from an economist, Peter Bauer, and it is an implication of the fact that entropy and evolution define our baseline. Everything that we rely on for food is itself an evolved organism that doesn't want to be eaten, would rather keep its flesh to itself. So even the struggle to feed ourselves is as an uphill battle. But yeah, a major insight of the Enlightenment is that we need to explain how wealth comes into existence. Adam Smith and his predecessors being the major theorists.
Yeah. So you mentioned negativity bias briefly in the talk, and why wouldn't negativity bias just be a wise acknowledgement of entropy? Because there are more ways to break things than to fix them. It's harder to fix them once they're broken than to break them. As you said, there's so many ways for things to go wrong and very few ways for them to go right. So why isn't a built-in pessimism just a clearer scene of that?
Yeah, well, it is. And I think the most plausible explanation for the negativity bias is that there are more ways for things to go wrong. And moreover, the things that can go wrong can do you much more harm than anything that goes right can help you. I mean, as I quote my late Stanford colleague Amos Tversky, who said, imagine today how many things could happen for the rest of the day that could make you much better off. You might think, oh, I don't know, I might meet an old friend, maybe I'll win the lottery, and then you start to run out pretty quickly. Now imagine all the things that could happen that could make you much worse off. I mean, the list is endless, and the harm is the degree of harm is bottomless, including death, of course. So I think it is adaptive to have that as individuals living in a natural environment. But since the Enlightenment, we have, as a species, enjoyed this highly unnatural state of progress, and we're not wired to appreciate it. We're wired for a world in which there was little to no progress.
And the role of journalism here is pretty crucial, because you make the point in the book that there's this classic idea about journalism that if it bleeds, it leads. And there's always going to be enough bad news to fill any broadcast, to fill any newspaper. But you make another point, which I had never thought of before, which relates to the non-monotonicity of these trends, these trends in progress. So perhaps define that concept for us, because it's useful.
Yeah. Well, on journalism, I certainly don't want to join in the chorus of denunciation of the mainstream media, because they are much better than some of the alternatives.
Yes. There is a distinction between Breitbart and the New York Times that we have to fight for. Yes.
A critical distinction, absolutely. But many journalists are starting to realize that the ethic that has dominated journalism, especially since the 1970s, that serious journalism means bad news. As one editor put it, journalism is bad news is journalism, good news is advertising. But of course there are benefits to exposing the problems in government and in the environment and in the rest of the world. But I think journalists have begun to realize that there can be kind of a corrosive aspect to that as well. That if the only thing gets reported is the fails, the crises, the catastrophes, the corruption, then it can leave people cynical about their institutions and open the door to the demagogues who say only I can fix it. And when Donald Trump in particular, who ran on a relentless campaign of negativity, that you can't walk down the street without getting shot, and there are no jobs in the cities, and no one's learning anything in school, the left did not really have a narrative to oppose him. And so it left the field open to him, to people who agree that society is just spiraling downhill. Well, why not vote for a radical? Nothing could be worse than what we have now, is the impression that the news conveys. Now, if the reality is that in fact there are massive improvements, they don't they don't attract headlines day to day, but if they're never reported, then there is no reason for anyone to have any confidence in institutions like democracy, like international organizations. And since things have gone right, they must have gone right somewhere at some time, and those should be reported too. So a movement within journalism, sometimes called constructive journalism or solutions journalism, such as in the New York Times, a feature by David Bornstein and Tina Rosenberg, has tried to shift that balance.
Yeah, but on the issue of the trend lines, so all those lines you show are going in the right direction, virtually all of them, but they're jagged, and there's this the concept of monotonicity, the fact that it's not only going down in every moment, so that you could actually, perhaps not even consciously fall into this pattern, but just do it. You could report the upticks of bad news, and honestly say, well, crime is 10% higher than it was last year, and do that again 5 years from now, and never acknowledge the progress. Or you wouldn't know you were actually misleading as to the general trend. Yes,
exactly. There are, I do call attention to two kind of gimmicks of journalism that add to the overall impression of decline. One of them is, if you have a trend that's going down with the occasional uptick, then what happens is the year-by-year decline, since it's the same as if there's a decline last year and the year before and the year before, then that's no longer news. But when there's an uptick, that's news. If there were, over, say, a span of 50 years, 2 years in which things got worse, and 48 years in which things got better, and the 2 years in which things got worse are news, and they get reported, and the other years in which things got better is never reported, then you have an impression that is exact opposite to reality. So that's one gimmick. There's another gimmick that columnists sometimes use, which is if you scan the news of the world for all of the things that are going wrong everywhere on Earth, every epidemic, every terrorist attack, and you put them together in a list, it'll always look really scary. It'll really look like the world is falling apart. And the thing is, you can always do that because the world is never going to be perfect.
So now how has the concept of the Enlightenment become a dirty word? Because all these associated terms that account for the progress are also tainted. So democracy, capitalism, globalization, cosmopolitanism is a word that you use a lot that carries absolutely no weight with most people. How have these been stigmatized concepts?
Yeah, among intellectuals, the Enlightenment is kind of a mixed bag. There are some who, as I do, praise it, credit it with our progress. But there are others who think that it's just was the harbinger of colonialism and slavery and genocide. And I treat this in the book that I think this is completely anachronistic. Slavery has existed in every society since the dawn of civilization. Imperialism has, by definition, characterized every empire, like the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Roman Empire. We call them empires because they were imperialists. They expanded their territory. They enslaved people. They wiped people out during their conquests. Colonialism, well, probably the most famous outcome of the Enlightenment was the United States of America, and its whole point was to push back against colonialism. That's why there was a revolution, why there was a revolutionary war. There's a habit among some intellectuals to blame everything that happened since 1800 on the Enlightenment, whereas a lot of the things that happened after 1800 were actually results of the counter-Enlightenment, the backlash against the ideals of the Enlightenment, extolling the nation, the culture, the tribe, the land, the lineage. Blood and soil was the motto for this movement. Fascism, which grew out of it. Romantic militarism. All of these which were promoted by people who made no bones about the fact that they detested the Enlightenment. That's what they were reacting against. And there are some intellectuals, though, who confuse all of these 19th century movements and say, well, since World War I happened after the Enlightenment, it was the fault of the Enlightenment, whereas the intellectual history, the paper trail, shows the exact opposite.
Yeah, so I want to talk about politics for a few minutes and how unhelpful it is in this area. But first, let's just tie down your politics. What political biases do you take to this project?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a moderate, a centrist, not because I believe that the truth always lies between two extremes, or Goldilocks principle, but out of first of all, an acknowledgement that there has been progress, so something must have gone right in the institutions that we have. An acknowledgement there can be alternatives that are much worse, such as Venezuela, such as Russia, such as Turkey, such as much of the Islamic world, in terms of measures of human flourishing. And that the recognition, which goes back, I guess, to Edmund Burke, that if the institutions of society are functioning halfway decently, if the streets aren't running with blood, if obesity is a bigger problem than starvation, if more people are clamoring to get out than running for the exits, then something must be going right compared to the space of alternatives, and that we should build on that. There are just so many more ways for things to go wrong.
So you're a leader of the alt-right?
Yes. This was, yes, one of the more bizarre things that I've been called, but yes. The book is almost in fact it is, in the chapter on humanism, I lay out why the alt-right is all wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen this, someone edited together part of a panel discussion that Steve was involved in, and made him seem like he was boosting for the alt-right, and that got a lot of traction for about a day and a half. So the attacks on, so I guess to take politics for another moment, how is the criticism of the Enlightenment, or the allergy to the Enlightenment, different on the left and the right? Do they have a different character? I mean, it does come from both sides.
It does come from both sides. From the right, there's the forces of nationalism and tribalism that we should, what we should advance is the glory of the nation, the natural destiny of greatness of Russia or the United States, and with the resignation of the fact that all nations should rightfully pursue greatness even at each other's expense, that there should be a zero-sum competition, and that it's only right that Russia try to be as great as it can while the United States tries to be as great as it can. This is almost a definition of Donald Trump's view of international relations, as opposed to the idea that there are vast possibilities for positive-sum cooperation, such as not going to war, to begin with, that are fostered by international norms and organizations. So that's one. Obviously, the idea that the source of our values should come from religion and scripture, also typically associated with the right, although not exclusively, would be another counter-Enlightenment theme. Looking back to a golden age as opposed to efforts toward increasing progress, that namely reactionary ideology, would be another right-wing counter-Enlightenment view. On the left, certainly Marxism was I would identify as a counter-Enlightenment ideology that saw history as a struggle, a zero-sum struggle between classes, and saw it had its own notion of progress, but that notion consisted ultimately of the vanquishing of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat. So it saw progress as defined by conflict rather than problem solving. Identity politics, which is more associated with the left than the right, is another form of tribalism that sees society as just a struggle for power, also zero-sum among different sexes, sexual orientations, and races, and that also has a contempt for science, that believes that science is not the pursuit of truth, but just another mythology, just a justification of power, that puts little stock in reason, that reason too is just a pretext for the powerful to consolidate their power, and that we shouldn't evaluate hypotheses for whether they're true or not, but look at whose interests they serve. So that's some of the left-wing opposition to Enlightenment values.
Yeah, but both sides seem to use this word scientism, and I'm wondering if anyone has ever said anything worth hearing after that word.
Well put, yes. It's one of these words that it's kind of a boo word. You say it and everyone's supposed to go boo. Kind of like neoliberalism is another one that's almost meaningless for the same reason.
So let's talk for a moment about the primacy of reason. Now, why is reason so good? How is reason something that either must be defended by everybody, even if they don't, even if they're not aware of it, or actually needs no defense?
Well, by the very act of asking the question, you've kind of answered it, because you've asked me for reasons. The fact that we're seeking to answer that question, in fact, any question, by stating propositions, questioning them, evaluating them, as opposed to, say, by who can mount the bigger posse, who can shout the loudest, who can bar the door to who else, bribery, beauty contests. The fact that we have abjured those ways of deciding which beliefs to embrace, but instead are asking questions and seeking answers, means that we're already committed to reason.
And how does this relate to concepts like the unity of knowledge?
So the unity of knowledge, another important Enlightenment idea, would say that there's not a divide between the social sciences, arts, humanities, sciences, that there's a continuous landscape of knowledge. I mean, there are logical differences among propositions. A mathematical or analytic or logical proposition is not the same as an empirical one, and both of those are distinct from normative statements, but that they all bear on each other, and that the divisions within the university, for example, into different faculties is just for the convenience of deans, not a fundamental epistemological divide between different kinds of subject matter.
Yeah, you and I have both been influenced by David Deutsch. You talk about him a bunch in the book, and he has this, David is really remarkable. He's been on the podcast, I think, twice, and he has this incredibly inspiring vision of just how powerful knowledge is, and it can sound tautological or otherwise circular when you state it, but I don't think it is. And it's this idea that whatever is compatible with the laws of physics can be achieved with the requisite knowledge. And so, I mean, just picture how hopeful this vision is. He imagines being able to just move into the vacuum of space, the relative vacuum of space, and sweep up stray hydrogen atoms and fuse those atoms into heavier elements, and then use those heavier elements to construct the smallest possible machine that can build itself and any other possible machine, and then use those machines to build fantastically complicated information processing creatures such as we are, and beyond. And the only thing that is lacking at every step is the requisite knowledge. And that's just this almost religious conception of how powerful knowledge is.
Well, I use it as one of the two epigraphs of the book.
Yeah.
In fact.
Yeah.
The other one from Spinoza.
So, I mean, do you fully subscribe to that vision of just basically that we're always standing at the beginning of infinity in terms of the possibility of what knowledge can do?
Yes. I mean, what he, of course, leaves out is cost.
Yeah.
And complexity. Some problems are exponentially hard. The more you apply them, the more complex they get, to a point where they could overwhelm any finite intelligence that's applying knowledge.
Right.
But nonetheless, I think the insight, as you say, it's almost tautological, because you could say that the definition of compatible with the laws of nature is that we can accomplish it with the right knowledge.
Right.
But at the same time, it is, I agree with you, kind of vaguely inspiring, in the sense that we can't achieve everything because of cost, because of combinatorial explosions, exponential complexity, but we can achieve a lot more than we might think if we didn't acknowledge that truth.
And of course, every variable that affects human flourishing is amenable to this kind of analysis. And so there's a moral argument that runs through your book, which is that we should care about human flourishing. That this is the norm that should matter to us, and not just human flourishing, but the flourishing of anything that can flourish. So if it's right if animals can suffer or experience well-being, we should care about those as well. This even is a controversial statement. So why is it that, I mean, both of us have been in this position before, but to have to defend that the flourishing of conscious creatures is the baseline standard of morality, is it surreal to you to have to defend that? Or
It is kind of surreal, because the thing that we might have been afraid of is that this would be considered so trite and banal and obvious and uncontroversial as not to be worth saying.
Yeah.
But in fact, it's ragingly controversial. And there are alternatives. The most obvious ones are from religion, namely that what is valuable is the fate of your soul in an afterlife as opposed to your years on earth. The degree to which you and other people conform to particular commandments as opposed to what we would identify as flourishing, states of flourishing like happiness, knowledge, richness of experience. There's also a notion that the experience of the teeming masses is irrelevant. That what all that counts are the feats of artistic or intellectual or military greatness of the heroes, the elites, the supermen, and that it is bourgeois sentimentality to think about the happiness of everyday people. This is a philosophy associated with Nietzsche,
Yeah.
and with a surprising number of artists and intellectuals, some sympathetic to Nietzsche, who often have a contempt for the masses because they live such soulless, conformist, consumerist, decadent lives. Their lives are almost not worth living if they don't achieve something great. And there's a fascinating book by John Carey called The Intellectuals and the Masses, where he documents that a lot of early 20th century literary intellectuals had a kind of contempt for the masses that literally bordered on the genocidal. They often had genocidal fantasies that the world would be better if you didn't have the masses of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie living their pathetic, meaningless existence. And that runs against the idea that all humans have a right to flourish, and we have an obligation to help them.
Yeah, there's this idea that somehow progress might not be enough, and this is something that's come up. I've read many of your negative reviews, Andrew Sullivan being one. I recommend you take Valium before you read Andrew's review of Steve's book. But it's this idea that somehow progress, as you said, is antiseptic or doesn't capture the totality of what we might care about. And this is expressed, another example here is the rise of Jordan Peterson, which many people have remarked upon. It seems like he has unmasked in the secular community a kind of hunger for a quasi-religious orientation toward mythology and meaning, and there's a sense that progress, again, even just grabbing all the variables you witness, so health and wealth and free time and everything else, peace, that it carries with it its own shadow side, that somehow the more everything gets better, the worse it's actually getting. And Jordan is you just disparage Nietzsche, and you go after him hard in your book as a kind of psychopath, and I actually agree. I think if Nietzsche were alive today and had access to a gun, he would probably be our next school shooter. Although his suicide note would be brilliant, so it would be a masterpiece. But there's this sense that we are, the better things get, we are getting drawn into some sort of almost attractor state of meaninglessness and malaise, and there's just terrible darkness awaiting us there. How do you deal with this concern?
I like Andrew Sullivan. I know him, but his review was bizarre, not least because it was based actually not on reading the book, but coming to a talk. And then he talks about all the things that I left out of the book, but he didn't read the book, he said, including the question of happiness and quality of life, each of which got a separate chapter because they're not necessarily the same thing.
Well, this is actually a recurring theme. I noticed that many of your detractors dance on your grave, trumpeting points that you actually anticipate an answer in the book.
Yeah.
And
that's why the book is so long. I knew what the objections would be, and I tried to answer them. But just to take these examples, I mean, among the bizarre things that Andrew had in his review were the claim that with all of this progress, how come we have all gotten so miserable? Why is there are increases in suicide and depression and anxiety? And I actually have a chapter, and I fact-checked these claims. And in fact, they're not true. The vast majority of countries have gotten happier. The vast majority of people say that they are happy. So the claim that we're all familiar with, that the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, from Henry David Thoreau. How a recluse living in a cabin on a pond could know this was never made clear. But the mass of men disagree. So in these happiness surveys, most people, actually majority of people, call themselves pretty happy or happier. And there's a widespread fallacy, there's actually a systematic illusion that people underestimate the happiness of other people.
Right.
So you ask people, how happy are you? They say, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, 7 or 8. How happy do you think your neighbors are? Oh, 4, 3. Huge gap. And it's
That's the optimism gap, right?
yeah, an optimism gap. And for happiness, it's a chasm. There's also again, going back to the some of the both religious and romantic heroic opposition to the Enlightenment, the idea that somehow if you live a life that you earn a living, you bring up kids, you enjoy what life has to offer, somehow that's meaningless or soulless or decadent. And I try to address that by saying, okay, what could we all agree are ingredients of a good life above and beyond just being happy? You could say maybe being happy is having a smile on your face, that's just superficial. But let's say you consider access to the great works of humankind. That is, being able to see great art, read great novels, listen to great music, see great films. These have massively expanded. I mean, all of us have a little device in our shirt pocket where we can get access to any of the great films, all of the great recorded music, something that even when we were younger would have been just luxuries for the few. If you wanted to see, when I was a student, if you wanted to see Rashomon, you had to wait years and in the hopes that it would show up at a repertory theater or on late night television. You probably would be disappointed. Now, I could watch Rashomon right now. That's an example of how some of the higher callings in life, such as appreciating great art and culture, are increasingly available.
You're going to be disappointed faster now.
Yeah, right. Or ability to enjoy, to see the wonders of the world. One graph that I didn't show is that the cost of air travel has plunged and the number of air trips that people take have risen. Variety of cultural experience, simply the number of kinds of food that we can enjoy has vastly increased. In just about any neighborhood, any town in the country, you can go out for Thai food or Mexican food or Vietnamese food. A few decades ago, it would be pork and potatoes. So you name what makes life worth living, and they've all increased. Now, of course, that doesn't count life in existence in an afterlife. But I think you could argue that belief in an afterlife as the source of meaning and purpose is highly pernicious because it devalues life on earth. It says that death is a mere rite of passage, kind of like a midlife crisis or a bar mitzvah. You're just going on to a longer period, and so who cares about the 70 or 80 years you have on earth? So I'd say the idea that life is meaningful because of what happens after we die is actually rather dangerous.
I think it might be indistinguishable from some bar mitzvahs I've actually been to. So let's just see if we can find a kernel of truth in this worry, because it strikes me that there could be a kind of uncanny valley of well-being, because so much of our sense of our own well-being is comparative, right? So what you have in a very prosperous society like our own, increased wealth inequality. And when you're comparing yourselves to others, many people feel they're diminished because they're just following so many extraordinarily lucky people on Instagram. And I mean, actually, if you've never seen Steve's nature photography, Steve is an amazing nature photographer. You can see his photos on his website. I've actually had this experience with you. I've looked at some of your photos, and I'm thinking, why am I podcasting in my basement while Steve is out there photographing flamingos? So you're actually part of this problem. So is it conceivable to you that everything can be getting better and better, and yet a significant proportion of people, even the luckiest people, are feeling worse and worse?
Yeah, there is that kind of suspicion of that FOMO, fear of missing out, is one of the hazards of social media, that social media are leading to a whole generation of miserable teenagers. That was especially popularized by a story in The Atlantic by Jean Twenge, a researcher who I have a lot of respect for. But I think that the big picture is that that's all exaggerated, that the decline that Twenge called attention to in the Atlantic article. It's a really tiny little decrease in happiness when it's measured over the full scale. And by and large, the studies of effects of social media show that for a lot of people, it increases sense of well-being and happiness. The main source of unhappiness from social media, according to a huge Harris survey, comes when we learn about the misfortunes of people that we like, that we feel their pain, and that is the major source of unhappiness from social media. So, I mean, it's also such a recent development, social media. It tends to get blamed for just about every social problem, political, personal, emotional, cultural. And while not denying that there certainly have been problems, especially political, it has been around for so little time that we haven't really developed norms and countermeasures to allow us to enjoy the advantages without some of the disadvantages. And I think there's reason to believe that, as with other technologies, like telephones, which in their time were blamed for disrupting family life and interrupting meals and having people be slaves to the receiver, that we developed workarounds and life turned out to be okay.
Right. It strikes me there's a related concern here where, you talk about this in the book, so you take something like terrorism, which people fear and we marshal massive resources to prevent, and I think you compare it favorably to what bees and wasps do to us every year. More people die from bee stings and wasp stings than terrorism in the U.S. But it seems to me so just imagine a terrorist attack, an order of magnitude larger than September 11th. So 30,000 people die in a city based on something. Given that our overreaction to that, purely by virtue of a rational response to body count, what must be deemed an overreaction, is guaranteed, right? Given that we can't treat it like a hurricane, or we can't treat it like an outbreak of flu. We can't treat it like the highway deaths that are going to happen every year until we get autonomous cars, and that's the same scale, about 30,000 people a year now. Don't we have to price in that overreaction if we're guaranteed to fight multiple wars and spend trillions of dollars and suffer massive economic dislocation, even with an event at that scale, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that the measure of how bad terrorism in fact is?
Yes, although it's overpricing the terror that leads to some of the very pernicious effects that you mentioned, such as treating it as such an existential threat that we have to, say, go to invade Iraq. And the worst effects from terrorism come from overpricing it, namely the extreme reactions, especially when it comes to invading other countries. So I do think it's fair that because there's a psychological cost to deaths from terrorism that there isn't from equivalent causes of death like drowning in bathtubs and dying from bee and wasp stings, that we could take measures that are commensurate with that extra fear. And I mentioned in the book that there certainly is a special psychological category of fear of someone trying to kill you, presumably because whereas the accidents, even if they kill us in much greater numbers than terrorists, but they don't consist of some intelligent agent that's trying to kill you, whereas terrorism does. That's what it capitalizes on, namely, it's called terrorism because it generates terror, and we have greater terror of an intelligent agent that is overcoming obstacles to do us in than in the fickle finger of fate. So I think that could be factored in, but it's been factored in way too much. It's been factored in, the invasion of Iraq being the prime example, but also the fact that for many voters, for example, in the 2016 election, terrorism was their top concern. And they, something that, again, Donald Trump capitalized on, that the country was not safe, that it was immigrants that were responsible for it, and the fact that it was exaggerated because we do have this fear I think actually multiplied the negative effects of terrorism.
Yeah, and if bees and wasps were smart and having meetings about how much they wanted to kill us, that would be scary. Yeah.
Yes, that is true.
So, actually, I should revisit this issue of the alt-right, because the panel discussion you were on that got cut up and used to defame you was actually very interesting. You have an argument about how political correctness is enabling this rise of kind of alt-right populism. Let's run through that a bit. Why is political correctness dangerous for us?
Yeah. By the alt-right, I was not referring to tiki torch carrying skinheads, which is sometimes the term alt-right is applied to, but the original sense of internet savvy, often tech savvy, generally young men who found each other on the internet and later on social media. Many of them highly intelligent, highly analytic, but felt that they were ostracized, they were kept from certain truths by the taboos and conventions of mainstream intellectual life, particularly in universities. And when they stumbled across scientific or statistical facts that were undiscussable in the universities, felt this enormous sense of empowerment, that they discovered a truth that the mainstream couldn't handle. It made them feel that they could reject all of the mainstream body of understanding and knowledge. That sometimes they called it taking the red pill, an illusion from the matrix of seeing reality. And because they then were able to share these facts in their own discussion groups without any kind of pushback or debate or refutation from the rest of intellectual life, they could develop into pretty toxic forms. And if you look at, say, the speeches of Milo Yiannopoulos, what he proposes is taking some statistical generalization and then spinning it into completely outrageous conclusions, perhaps deliberately to inflame and to goad. So, for example, the fact that there are differences in life priorities on average between men and women, there are enormous amounts of data that show that this is true, that if you ask people to rate how important is family, how important is career, how important is recreation, how important is social activism, the distributions you get for men and women are not identical. I mean, I hope I haven't shocked anyone, but all of the questionnaires your guidance counselor gave you in high school, you add them up, there are millions of data points, and they show that men and women are not exactly the same. Milo Yiannopoulos says,
well... Unfortunately, there's 100 female lumberjacks in the room tonight, so a lot of pushback.
So this is a fact. It doesn't mean, now of course, and this is an argument I made in the blank slate, there's nothing particularly dangerous about this fact. It doesn't mean licensed discrimination because the distributions overlap. We should treat people as individuals, not as members of a gender. So fairness does not require sameness. They must be distinguished. But because the fact could be discussed, then the political and moral implications could be put into context. Whereas in a community that just feels a revelation that they could talk about this fact amongst themselves, then you get Milo saying, well, we should not admit women to grad school because they're more likely to drop out when they have children, or to med school, which is a completely preposterous, pernicious conclusion, but one that wasn't laughed out of court because he was able to say it in this closed forum of people who heard it for the first time. And there are other facts like that which can be domesticated in the crucible of open debate and criticism and refutation, but if they are taboo, then I think that creates a space where people who stumble upon them can draw the worst possible conclusions without opposition from the greater intellectual community. So that was the dynamic which I think has led to the alt-right in its original sense. One of my co-panelists, Wendy Kaminer, the civil liberties lawyer, cited a bunch of data that suggested that many of the voters of Trump really were not unemployed coal miners or steel workers. They were infuriated by what they perceived as political correctness, by the hypersensitivity, the inability to express certain opinions, and that was statistically a significant factor in the 2016 election.
How concerned are you by the fake news phenomenon, both the real fake news phenomenon and the fact that this phrase fake news has been weaponized against real news?
Yeah. Concerned. Yeah. I do think those are dangerous developments, both of them.
There was just like 2 days ago, there was some MIT research that suggested that lies spread faster on social media than truths. Did you see this? It seems like there are features of, I don't know that it was explained, it was just kind of the lies tend to be more novel. The thing you would lie about would be a stronger claim that is stickier. But
there are, I think we should study it, we should try to think of countermeasures. But although there are studies that show that fake news is mainly believed by people who are committed to an ideology, who are just seeking more affirmation. And in fact, I do discuss in the chapter on reason the fact that our critical faculties are most crippled when it comes to beliefs that affirm the goodness or righteousness of our tribe, sometimes called blue lies, where a white lie is something that you tell for the benefit of the addressee, and a blue lie is something that you tell for the benefit of the coalition of your tribe. And it's possible, I don't know what the latest studies demonstrate, but that at least one study showed that the people who circulate the fake news, the preposterous conspiracy theories, are already committed. It's not as if their mind was changed by them, but they avidly circulate them to whip up the team. Right.
Well, let's take a few minutes to talk about existential risk, which is something that you poo-poo to some degree in the book. It's not that you don't think there are existential risks, but
no, I think there are.
I know you think there are, but like some of the sexier ones are ones you think are overindulged.
Yeah.
Like AI and this. As you know, we all have our hobby horses, and being concerned about AI has become one of mine. So let's just see if we can. I just want to see where you get off the train here, and I should say that both my mother and my mother-in-law are watching now, so this is not the time to prove me wrong in public. It's an ancient debate technique that always works. So let's start with the concept of existential risk. So what do you think is a legitimate concern with respect to existential risk?
I don't know whether climate change is literally an existential risk, but it is a risk that could cause such immense human suffering that we should take it seriously. Whether it will kill off the last member of Homo sapiens is not my main concern.
But road warrior is good enough, right?
That would be good enough. Certainly nuclear war, which again, whether or not it's an existential risk, it is certainly a catastrophic risk.
Right.
Only under a nuclear winter scenario, itself controversial, and which would require not just one or two nuclear bombs going off, but hundreds. But I would treat them in the category of catastrophic risks, whether or not they're existential. Yeah.
So you're not a prepper.
No.
You're not getting ready for this. You don't have guns stockpiled and food.
I don't have a bunker. I don't have that. That's right. But I do think that that the threat of nuclear war has been almost criminally downplayed as an election issue, and that it is a fault of political parties, the press, citizens to not make it a more central issue, given the extreme costs that it could have.
Yeah, that's been one of the more alarming things to witness in the last few years, that the people who are on the inside of the conversations that worry about nuclear war seem to be as alarmed. I mean, someone like William Perry seems to be as alarmed as at any point in our history of the Cold War, and yet on the outside, this issue has more or less gone away, apart from the noises that North Korea has made of late.
Yeah. So just in the 2016 election, where nuclear war really should have been an obsession of the debates, of the evaluation of the candidates, simply because one of the flaws of our system of control of nuclear weapons is that the president has far more discretion than anyone could justify, and we've got a man who's notoriously impulsive and vindictive. Now, it may be that there's a happy ending, maybe that the biggest threat in a generation, namely the possibility of nuclear war with North Korea, will be diffused. I mean, I'm not celebrating yet, but this should have been a much bigger issue than, for example, the email server.
Yeah. Okay, so tell me where you get off this train toward my concern about AI. So we have this phenomenon of intelligence, right, born of information processing in a complex system like a brain. And presumably you think there's nothing magical about having a computer made of meat, right? So you think that intelligence clearly can be substrate independent, right? So we've already built intelligent machines. They're very narrowly intelligent, but they're getting better and better, and they're actually even superhuman within their narrow application. So that the calculator in your phone is superhuman with respect to arithmetic. It's never going to get worse than that unless we consciously make it worse. So I think we both agree, for instance, that human-level AI is a mirage, because the moment we get anything that's at all human-like in its generality, if we cobble together the top 100 cognitive functions that we like and make something that passes the Turing test in some robust way, it will be superhuman. It'll be superhuman as a calculator. It'll have a superhuman memory. It'll be superhuman in playing chess or Go or anything else that has already exceeded human capacity. So let's take me to the point where we develop a system, however unanalogous to a human brain and a human mind it might be. It could be this piecemeal effort of cobbling together the top 100 operations, right? Facial recognition, natural language processing. We get something that is superhuman with respect to all of those functions. Do you doubt that that's possible? Do you think that, or do you think that will inevitably happen if we continue to make progress in hardware and software design?
Well, they could happen if we wanted to duplicate all those things. Some of them we may not, just not economically worth it in terms of paying off the research effort, because we do have humans. But even the scenario that you just described is not an existential risk.
I just wanted to see where our intuitions start to divide. Yeah. Right? So you imagine something that is.
But by the way, I don't think we're anywhere close to that, and there, I think that's the consensus of most artificial intelligence researchers. So it's not as if that's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years. Yeah,
well, it's interesting. There are the people who seem most likely to push the ball into the end zone, and the people who are sort of on the fringe, but still count themselves among the computer scientists and roboticists and AI people who should know what's going on. And you tend to hear different noises coming from the kinds of people who work at DeepMind, for instance, which is sort of everyone's most likely candidate to push this into the end zone. But for me, the time frame is is a non sequitur, in the sense that the time frame is only consoling if, let's just say we stipulated we know this isn't going to happen for 20 years or 50 years, right? It can't happen. That should only be consoling if we knew that 20 years or 50 years was enough time for us to figure out how to do it safely, right? It's like there's a built-in assumption there that is enough time to work it out. But if it takes 75 years to figure out how to do it safely, and it's coming in 50 years, well then it's going to get very interesting 50 years from now. The other issue for me with respect to time is that we know we're really bad, or certainly there are historical examples that show that we can be really bad at forecasting when these breakthroughs will happen. So I think one of the Wright brothers, when asked how long heavier than air flight would take, I think he said 50 years from now, when they were about 2 years from actually doing it.
Although that goes both ways. There are many innovations that are just around the corner that we still don't have.
No doubt, no doubt. But I mean, the most startling example of this is the fact that Stuart Russell, the computer scientist, often references that Lord Rutherford, perhaps the most knowledgeable nuclear physicist at that moment in history, said that initiating a nuclear chain reaction to get energy was just moonshine. That's a quote. And literally 24 hours later, Leo Szilard delivered the goods, and within a few short years we had designs for weapons and all the rest. So we know that even the people closest to making the breakthroughs can often be bad at predicting. But for me, the time issue is actually a non-issue, because if we don't know how long it will take to do it safely, and worse still, we know that the incentives are wrong. We know we're in a kind of arms race condition where people are racing to get as much intelligence as they can get, and this actually comes back to entropy. There are more ways to do this dangerously than to do this safely, presumably, right? There are more ways to build AI that's not perfectly aligned with our interests than it is to build AI that is perfectly aligned. So what about this scenario of all these different operations, Google and Facebook and China and who knows who else is in this race condition, just forging ahead without a global understanding of how we will finally push into the end zone safely? I mean, it's the final yard, whenever that comes, that seems dangerous to people. And again, this is not a matter of imagining spontaneous malevolence. It's not like we're going to have armies of Terminator robots attacking us. It's just the prospect of building something that is more intelligent than we are, that can form its own goals by virtue of its being intelligent.
Well, that was a huge step that what you just said, forming its own goals.
But look what we've but haven't we done just that? So we were designed by evolution based on goals that were quite simple. As you know, it's just to spawn and get our genes into the next generation and hang around long enough so that our progeny can do likewise. Evolution can't see 99.9% of what we're doing, right? It can't see conversations like this. It didn't anticipate that we would care about any of the things we care about. Certainly didn't anticipate contraception and chastity and celibacy and all the other things that people do that are starkly against the logic of the utility function that evolution gave us. So couldn't you see that we could design machines that we would put in their goals and their utility function, but they could escape us in the way that we have escaped the dictates of evolution? We could actually be blind to the mental lives that they develop.
Well, just to be clear what the scenarios are, and I've looked in some detail at the so-called existential threat of artificial intelligence. They'd be things like we would give an artificial general intelligence the goal of curing cancer, and it would turn us all into involuntary guinea pigs for fatal experiments. Or we would give it the goal of making paper clips, and it would turn all available matter into paper clips, including our bodies.
Right. Well, but in defense of Nick Bostrom, that is just a cartoon meant to illustrate this point that artificial intelligence could be, for 2 points. One is that it's not going to have common sense unless we put the common sense into it, or it spontaneously develops the common sense that we would recognize. But two, there really is the prospect of intelligence being radically foreign to us, that we could design something that could, in the extreme case, improve itself in a way that, or make changes to itself in a way that would develop a goal structure that is just highly unintuitive to us and, again, possibly misaligned with our well-being.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is usually to make those scenarios plausible, there has to be some exponential takeoff, some foom, as they call it, based on the comic book sound effect. And that I think there are a number of problems with these scenarios. I mean, one of them is that a lot of them, not all, but project human motives onto the very concept of intelligence. Now, as you say, we're products of evolution. Our intelligence comes bundled with the obvious motives that you would expect in a competitive process of evolution, such as dominance, competition for resources. And there's a tendency to assume that anything that is intelligent will also come bundled with some urge to dominate. And that's why you have, I think, rather misleading analogies like, well, we vanquished technologically less advanced societies when we colonized the world, that we vanquished other species, and therefore a more intelligent artificial system will inevitably vanquish us. So I think that this is now, granted, many of the proponents of artificial intelligence as an existential risk recognize that this is a fallacy, simply because being smart and wanting something are just completely independent. You could have an artificial intelligence that sacrificed itself, that did nothing, did not care about its own longevity. I use the analogy of the Al Cap's creatures of the shmoos, which are the ultimate altruists. These are highly intelligent creatures that barbecue themselves for our benefit, because their altruism is built into their intelligence. So these are totally independent, and I think a lot of the doomsayers recognize that, but it keeps coming even though they explicitly disavow the idea that an intelligent system will be megalomaniacal, it creeps back into the scenarios like, oh, but then it will inevitably want to preserve its own existence, maximize resources, and therefore it'll consume us in the process. So I think that's one recurring fallacy. Another one is just the assumption that there is such a thing as a scale of intelligence in which you can place.
Why do you doubt that? Well, why do you doubt that with respect to? I mean, granted, there are different forms of intelligence, right? So how you compare our intelligence in every respect to the intelligence of an octopus, that's a hard problem.
Yeah.
Clearly, there are things that an octopus is better at than we are. But for any dimension of intelligence that you would recognize, clearly there's a continuum, and there's no good reason to think that we are at the summit of any of them.
Well, we actually don't know. David Deutsch, for example, argues that there's only one kind of intelligence, that any intelligent system is going to have to depend on knowledge, and there's only one way of acquiring knowledge, and that is the process of conjecture and refutation.
Right.
So it may be that aside from sheer processing speed, there isn't some different quantum or order of magnitude of intelligence greater than ours. And indeed, one problem in a lot of these scenarios, such as the AI system that will foil our attempt to contain it by brainwashing us, by rewiring our brains, and by the way, I'm not making these, as you know, I'm not making these scenarios up.
Yeah.
That they...
I've met these people.
Yes. They assume that there is a coherent thing called artificial general intelligence, which I suspect is not a coherent concept. That intelligence,
But is human intelligence a coherent concept?
Oh yeah, but human intelligence is a number of different systems that solve particular problems that we faced in the course of our evolution and that we try to extend and stretch by analogy and by education. But the idea that if you could take what humans have and just multiply it by 10 or 100 or 1,000 and have an ability to solve any problem, I think is incoherent. It almost, in a lot of these discussions of AI existential risk, the artificial general intelligence of the future is almost, you could almost substitute the word God, and the sentence would work just as well. Or the other analogy that I use is Laplace's demon, the hypothetical entity that knows the position and velocity of every particle in the universe, plugs them into Newton's laws, other laws of physics, and can predict what will happen at any point in the future. The idea of an intelligence that will exponentially take off and be able to cure cancer, brainwash us, transmute elements into paper clips, rewire our brains, assumes that solutions to problems can be arrived at just by raw cogitation without having to...
Or simulated experiments. You can run experiments in simulation.
The simulations are only as good as the data that feed them. Right. And the acquisition of knowledge depends on interacting with the real world, which has to unfold according to the time scale of the real world, and of course requires intense interfaces with the real world that we can either give or not give artificial intelligence systems. So I think
what would have to happen to worry you? Like what development would make you think?
For artificial intelligence?
Yeah.
Oh, if for some reason the entire culture of safety among engineers mysteriously vanished, and engineers did unbelievably stupid things, like putting control of the water level of a dam in an untested and not very intelligent system, and where they gave it a very vague goal, such as regulate the water level, period, and to regulate the water level, it drowned a town. Now, again, I'm not making this up. This is not my example. It's not a caricature. It's not a straw man. That, I think, was from Sir Martin Rees. Or somehow an artificial intelligence system was built that had both this Laplace's demon ability to calculate the state of the universe and somehow also managed to control every molecule of the universe and was given some goal like make people happy. Now, I don't worry about that because that's what it would take to worry me, and that's not going to happen.
But what about just someone putting a self-improving AI onto the internet, just out in the wild?
What is self-improving in what way?
Well, something that can make changes to its own source code in a way that its designers don't necessarily understand. So it's.
But what does that actually consist of? I mean, better is not you can't have an algorithm that just achieves betterness. It has to be better at something.
No, yeah. So let's say it's better at trading stocks, right? I mean, the thing that worries me, I mean, far sooner than anything like superhuman AGI is going to arrive, which is the idea that there's something so potentially brittle about our civilization now, given our dependence on something like the internet or something like financial markets. I mean, just imagine what would happen if some brilliant company decided to unleash their trading algorithms and the Dow inexplicably went to zero, right? And we had to figure out where all the money went, right? I mean, this is a very discrete problem that is probably conceivable computationally. It's not. You could imagine, and this is, I guess, this connects to something like cyber terrorism or cyber war. That you can imagine a targeted disruption of the financial system, say, or the stock market, that we would, again, it is like, in some ways it's like terrorism. It's like, or even a smaller problem like a school shooting. 20 people die. Well, 20 people die all the time for all kinds of reasons that we don't panic about. But and here we're just talking about zeros and ones in the cloud. But if you can't figure out where your money went or how much you have for any significant period of time, and this could be massively destabilizing. And this is short of anything that is, truly science fictional.
Well, I do worry about instability of financial markets because of features like instruments like derivatives, like high-speed trading that have built-in positive feedback loops that could lead to crashes and bubbles, as we experienced in 2007, 2008. Although I don't see that as a problem of artificial intelligence. I mean, I see that problem as financial markets.
You can imagine that people, the first thing that people in this arms race are going to try to do with their AI is make money with it. It's not
Well, yeah,
won't be
but
the last thing.
I think that's a problem of making financial markets more resilient and less vulnerable to positive feedback loops. But I don't see that as a problem of artificial intelligence per se, and I certainly don't think it's an existential threat.
No.
And so, aside from the fact that I think a lot of the existential threat scenarios, the idea that artificial intelligence is more dangerous than nuclear weapons, that it could be our final invention, spell the end of humankind, I think it's based on a number of fallacies. And by the way, this is not just my analysis, but Nick Bostrom, who's one of the, of course, prime stokers of fear of existential risk, did a survey among the 100 most frequently cited researchers in AI and found that 92% discounted the threat of catastrophe.
So in the near term, I think. I don't think most people doubt the possibility of something like an intelligence explosion. Where
actually, I think I think I disagree.
Okay, well,
if you look at the
table that and look at,
if you look at people like Rodney Brooks, Peter Norvig, Nathan Myhrvold.
But I'm about to debate Rodney at a conference. I mean, Rodney has been selected as a far outlier skeptic for on this particular point. And
I don't know if you.
But like someone like Stuart Russell, have you interacted with him? Because he actually literally wrote the textbook on AI that everyone's been using for over a decade.
With Peter Norvig, who does discount the threat. I mean, even Stuart Russell.
Stuart's among the most concerned. I mean, he's quite alarmed by the lack of concern among many of his colleagues. So.
Yes, although I think he actually answers some of his own concern when he said, and I quoted this in the book, that engineers don't talk about building bridges that don't fall down. They talk about building bridges.
Yeah, but he was making that point to opposite effect. That's how he expresses his alarm about the AI community just advancing the project of building more intelligent machines and then thinking of AI safety as an afterthought. I mean, there's nobody who's building bridges who thinks the not falling down project is a separate conversation they need to have. Right.
Yeah.
But in AI, that's what's happening. There's this separate conversation about AI safety.
Yeah, I don't see that. That is, I don't know of any AI researcher who would say, let's hand over the control of the water level behind a dam, and then need someone else to say, oh, by the way, and don't drown a town.
Yeah.
I don't see that as a problem within the AI community, and that's why most of the AI researchers really don't take these scenarios seriously. But just that was just a prelude to say that the analysis that I have in Enlightenment Now is not, I think is actually pretty typical of experts in AI. And I think the problems in the spinning out the doomsday scenarios are confusion of intelligence with motivation, particular megalomania, the mythical concept of an omniscient, godlike artificial general intelligence, which I think is an incoherent concept because intelligence is relative to a goal and to knowledge, and the idea that there is or will be exponential improvement in artificial intelligence so that it will run away from us as it recursively improves its own intelligence. In fact, assessments of progress in artificial intelligence have shown no evidence of exponential growth. If anything, there's exponential growth in just the number of transistors you can get on a chip in Moore's law, but that doesn't translate into exponential improvement in intelligence. No. In fact, probably a more typical, a more accurate curve would be kind of an S-shaped curve where there's a period of reasonable growth, and then, as they say, the last 1% of the problem takes as much effort and time and ingenuity as the first 99%, which is why even though it seems like we're on the verge of self-driving cars, which I think is as AI problems go, it's a relatively easy one, but we're not even going to see door-to-door driverless cars anytime soon, because it's what artificial intelligence researchers say, all the ones that I know, is that artificial intelligence is really, really hard. It looks easy from a distance until you actually have to engineer a system that people would actually use. And in fact, they are highly conscious of safety. That's why we don't have driverless cars going door to door already. It's not as if there's an AI safety community that has to remind the self-driving car community, oh, it shouldn't mow down people. And that's like as if any engineering problem, as in all of those curves that I showed of engineered systems becoming safer over time, that's just part of the culture of engineering, including artificial intelligence.
Well, wouldn't you agree that since we don't know how quickly this is going to happen, any safe path toward developing it has to include the possibility of it happening faster than we've been assuming? So that if the safety of our current path is only guaranteed by virtue of it happening very slowly and incrementally, that's probably not the safest possible path. Don't you think we need to anticipate something that is surprisingly fast?
No, I think that the idea of exponentially self-improving intelligence is probably incoherent, because in reality it's going to depend on knowledge, and knowledge has to be acquired via interaction with the world. Kevin Kelly has the term thinkism for the idea that problems can be solved by sheer rational cogitation without any interaction with the world. And I do think that's a fallacy. But let me just take a step back as to why are we having this conversation? Why do you care about it? Why do I care about it? I do think that obviously anything that we build, we should make it safe. And I just think, and I don't really see anyone in the artificial intelligence community who would deny that principle and would turn over huge amounts of infrastructure to a system that hasn't been tested. Of course, the counter argument is, well, it'll be so smart that it will fool us into passing a test for safety because it wants to achieve control without our constraining it. And again, that gets to the fallacies of instant omniscience and megalomania. So I don't worry about AI fooling us into thinking that it's safe and therefore escaping safety testing, which is another one of the scenarios. But just to put it, to step back, I think there is a risk that has not been faced by some of the purveyors of these doom scenarios, that if people are, and by people I mean everyone, are just given more and more scenarios in which our civilization is doomed, together with ones that I think should be taken seriously, like climate change and nuclear war, you pile on what I consider to be rather exotic and extremely improbable ones. It can't be a good thing if a huge percent of the population firmly believes that our civilization is doomed, as many do. Polls show that something like 25 to 30% of Americans believe that our civilization is going to come to an end within a few decades. Is that a good thing for people constructively engaging with the problems that we have? I don't think so. And in fact, other polls show that among people who think that our way of life is going to come to an end, a majority say, well, we should just look after ourselves and our families because our way of life is going to come to an end, there's nothing we can do about it. I think that is itself a risk, and that as we scare people to death, as we remind them, and we know also that the human sense of probability runs by a number of imaginable scenarios, that as we start to pile on those scenarios, then people can become fatalistic and not figure out, why should I even conserve on carbon emissions? If the global warming isn't going to kill me, then the runaway AI is going to turn me into paper clips, or make me a guinea pig in cancer experiments, or follow the command to make me happy by rewiring my brain, or putting me into a jar and brainwashing me into thinking I'm happy, and all these other scenarios. I think there's a real risk to that undisciplined disaster mongering that has not been factored into to this line of thinking, and I think that the sober thinking shows that most of these scenarios are just ill-conceived.
Yeah. Okay. Well. Yeah. Well, I fully agree that we should worry about only those things that are worth worrying about. We agree there. One of these days, I will drag you into a room with terrified AI researchers, and we'll perform an intervention. On that note, I want to open it up to questions from the audience, because the real advantage of events like this is to make it a proper conversation. And so there are microphones that will be appearing in the audience, in the aisles at each level, and we will go as fast as we can. While that's being prepared, I will ask you one short rapid-fire question. What belief do you have? Could be a fundamental scientific belief or intuition or something else. What are you most certain of, such that if the data contradicted it, you would have to say that the data are an error?
Yes. Well, I guess well, probably that the mind is completely determined by the physiological activity of the brain. So if there were apparent demonstrations of precognition, of telepathy, of mind over matter, of the soul surviving the death of the brain, I would look at those data twice. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so we're going to go to questions. I'll remind you that questions are great if they actually contain a question. And if you can't manage that, just end on a high rising tone and we'll be fooled. So we'll start over here.
Definitely. What practical advice would either of you have for improving the quality of conversation between two people who found themselves across an ideological divide?
Good, I got that.
I think you have some opinions on this, right?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to be able to restate the other person's position in a way that they would accept. Right? If you can't meet that test, you're not actually having a conversation. Right? I mean, you're certainly not having a profitable one. So if you're going to pretend to be reading somebody's mind and finding their actual motives for saying what they're saying that they won't acknowledge, right? That's a different kind of hostile grappling match than you need to actually change minds. So you need to first be able to interact with their actual view as they represent it to themselves, and that's so rarely met when you get to politically polarizing topics that it's just amazing to see that it almost never happens. So go back over here.
So, do you think, Stephen, in probably 300 years or 400 years, resource is infinite, is not infinite, is finite, and nation states might get at each other's throat? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, a couple things. I think resource shortages are a red herring, and I talk about this even though there's another kind of what Greg Easterbrook calls collapse anxiety, namely fear that no matter how good day-to-day life seems to be improving, we should still be on edge because it all might collapse tomorrow. That the idea of resource shortages has loomed large in that kind of discussion, and we've never run out of any resources. And the reason is we don't need resources. We need ways of getting around, lighting our homes, heating our homes, eating, and which resources we use to satisfy those needs depends on our state of knowledge, which changes. And as a resource starts to become scarce, its price rises, incentivizing people to figure out how to get it less accessible to deposits, or more often, to switch to some other resource. We've seen we're in the midst of a rather dramatic process of dematerialization that, thanks to electronic media, especially smartphones, we consume less stuff. We've reached peak stuff. We consume less paper, less newsprint, a lot of resources, not less carbon, which is something that we need to do. But the problem, of course, with carbon isn't that we're going to run out of the stuff, out of oil. The problem is there's too much of it. So I think that resource shortages are a red herring. In terms of conflict between, armed conflict between countries, there is an unmistakable trend. We don't know if it'll continue, but war between countries is becoming, is obsolescent. This is a point made by John Mueller as early as the 1980s, that the classic kind of war where nation A declares war against nation B, they face off with massive tank formations, naval battles, bombing each other's cities, is becoming rarer and rarer. The wars that occur are civil wars, some of which can become quite nasty if they have outside intervention. But conflicts between nations are fewer in number, and I think it's not utopian to think that in 300 or 400 years they could go the way of slave auctions and human sacrifice. There are only 192 nations. Increasingly they're realizing that war is a stupid way to resolve disputes, and it's entirely possible that that could go the way of customs.
So we'll go up a level.
Thank you, gentlemen, both, for the lucid conversation. My name is Zach, and I have another question in the vein of fostering better communication across ideological divides. Especially, what are your recommendations for strategies for fostering better communication with people with whom we might dramatically differ in terms of identity, culture, and experience? And particularly, do you see a role either for suspending our own skepticisms or objections, or for acknowledging the elements of truth in other people's experience, however miscalibrated they may be, in order to build better trust and connection, exert positive influence, and to evolve our collective understanding? Thank you.
Well, actually, I think I answered that question the first time around, but I would add one other piece, is that, and this is something this is a note you've struck a lot, Steve. Identity doesn't matter for most of our truth claims. I mean, the fact that you are you, identified in whatever way you want to be identified, by color of your skin or the nation of your birth or your religious orientation, that doesn't matter for any propositional claim you're going to make about the way the world is. So it's just, we have to get over that piece. I don't know if you have more on that topic, but...
Well, I think in answering the previous question, Sam did identify one of the techniques that has been identified as critical to having a constructive civilized discussion, namely summarizing your opponent's view in a way that they can agree to. There are some others. There's a literature on fostering critical thinking and constructive disagreement that includes other things like just even being forced to explain your understanding of your own position. A lot of people who are dead set against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example, if you ask them, what is the Trans-Pacific Partnership? They kind of go, I don't know. And that we have an illusion of understanding that can often be disabused when we're forced to defend things. And then you find that some disagreements actually lessen when people are forced to come to common ground on what they're actually talking about. Another one is there's a technique in science that is occasionally used called adversarial collaboration, where you get two people who disagree about a hypothesis to come to agree on what would settle it, what experimental outcome, and encourage them to collaborate in just what conceivably could reduce their difference.
Right. So we'll go up there.
Hi, my question's about evolution. I'm curious what both of you would think about a world where things are getting increasingly complicated and we start to discover things that we're hardwired to be ill fit for. For example, we're hardwired to crave sugar, which is not a problem when we're hunter-gatherers, but in a world where sugar is very abundant, these problems arise. Do you worry about that on a general level?
Yeah, I think that is a source of a lot of our discontent, our problems. A lot of our cravings, our addictions come often from artificial substances that were synthesized precisely to engage those ancient motivational systems. and that we'll have to develop norms and therapies and expectations that are explicitly designed to marginalize our anachronistic or obsolete desires.
Yeah, I would add that much of our concern about social media now seems to be of a piece with that, which is we're having an experience on social media that is completely unlike anything we've evolved to have. So it just you have anonymity and no face-to-face interaction, and the inner maniac comes out in every conversation. So, let's go down here.
So veganism is a topic that means an awful lot to me, and I'm not going to be one of those guys that goes in here and tries to heckle people the way that vegans often get a reputation of militancy for, and I think that that's generally counterproductive. But my question is, people will often reason their way to a moral position, but you don't see them adopt that moral position in real life. And I'm wondering why there's that disconnect of reason and application. Robert Sapolsky, in his recent book, talked about associating things with disgust when it comes to morality, and there being you having to do something to that effect to actually apply morals that you reason to. I'm wondering what both of your thoughts are about this.
Yeah, well, it's hard to do what you acknowledge as good. That's one question. Whether or not veganism is actually the most moral prescription, I think we can debate that. But do you have a sense of the acrasia problem, that you know what you should be doing, but you find it hard to actually do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is part of the human condition, and we do because we have these built-in drives. We like the taste of meat. We like a lot of things that we can't justify. And it's a question of a combination of self-control and of norms that we share that push us away from urges that we cannot justify. That is one part of human nature, namely, you don't want to be looked down upon by the people you respect, can push back against another, namely, you enjoy activities that you can't justify.
Yeah, I mean, norms do a lot of work that we can't individually do, right? So it's hard. If you had to get up every morning and reinvent civilization for yourself, it would be hard to be a civilized person. I mean, so much of what we effortlessly do that is good and moral and civil is the result of our having internalized norms that everyone is abiding by. And so there certainly could come a time where we will look back on the details of factory farming, and it'll be like looking back on the slaveholders of the relatively distant past, and we'll just be aghast that it was ever so. I think there's an interesting ethical wrinkle with respect to the prospect of farming in such a way that the lives of farm animals are net positive, right? So that it's better to have existed as a cow than to have not existed at all. And if we had some sense that these are indeed happy cows, well, then it would be better to raise them and treat them well and then finally eat them than it would be to not have done any of that and manage to just engineer tofu that is so healthy that we can live off of it. So I think it's an interesting ethical problem, but I would certainly acknowledge that what we have currently is not like that, and that it is a horror show. So, over here.
Dr. Pinker, you've written about how contemporary art denigrates beauty, which makes me curious about what contemporary living artists you do enjoy, specifically in visual arts, not music or performance.
Did you say that?
What is the question? I'm sorry.
You said apparently that contemporary art denigrates beauty, and she wants to know what the hell are you talking about?
What contemporary artists, living artists, do you enjoy? Visual artists and not performance or music.
Geez, where to begin? There are a lot that, well, I'm not going to, instead of naming names, I'll just say that I strongly believe there should be a diversity of art forms, that different people obviously have different tastes. There are different theories behind the purpose and function of different art forms. My comment, which was from the blank slate, wasn't so much a recommendation of what art one ought to consume or enjoy or produce, but just a historical comment that a lot of the denigration of beauty in contemporary art, the fact that one often goes to museums of contemporary art and sees works that are deliberately grotesque, I think comes from the denial of human nature, the endorsement of the theory of the blank slate, the idea that we don't have any aesthetic standards built in, which is, I think, dominated a lot of intellectual culture in the 20th century. And so it was more of an explanation of why the art world has gone in this direction than a statement of either my own tastes or a recommendation as to what other people ought to value in art.
Can we go up one more level?
I was curious if you guys think that the Enlightenment is the peak or end-all be-all of ideas for human flourishing, and if not, where do you think the next revolution will come from?
Well, certainly the ideas that were advanced in the second half of the 18th century could not possibly be the peak, because that would contradict some of those very ideas, namely that there is an open-ended process of scientific and rational discovery, of a possibly escalating set of standards as to whose flourishing we should try to maximize. As David Deutsch put it, and Sam summarized this quote, we're always at the beginning of infinity. And the idea of the Enlightenment was that there isn't a peak, that we can always ask, in the case of scientific understanding, what is the best explanation for the best theory that we have now? How do we dig deeper and continue to ask the question, why is the world like this? Why is this theory the one that seems to hold? And that is a process that can go on forever. I don't think there's any limit to the kinds of suffering that we can seek to alleviate. Once we make enough people happy, then we can also expand it to other sentient creatures. So it's the process that's open-ended rather than a particular set of principles that could possibly have been the peak or the pinnacle.
Up here.
Thank you. So this was mentioned briefly tonight, and I just wanted you to expand a little bit. You mentioned identity politics, and very often, Mr. Harris, you focus on it as a scourge on the left. And I'm wondering if there's a reason that you don't recognize it or make much importance of it on the right.
Oh, well, those are all the applause waiting for me to overcome my fascism. Well, it's just so obviously a problem on the right. I mean, it's just, does anything need to be said about why it's problematic to be a white supremacist or a neo-Nazi, or, I mean, it's just, the place where it masquerades as finely calibrated morality is on the left. And that's the problem. So, is that there? Yeah.
One of the main concerns that the unfortunately now deceased Stephen Hawking had was that of the end of humanity. In particular, he would often discuss the proliferation of nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, and the inevitable danger of climate change. And if I remember correctly, he gave humanity around 100 years left to live. That seems like a rather, short time span. From now, I would probably bump it up to 500. But my question specifically was whether or not you guys think we have anything to be concerned in regards to our seemingly inevitable extinction.
Well, I'm the pessimist up here, so don't ask me. Well, you acknowledge that if we could come back in 1,000 years, we might be unrecognizable to ourselves, or 10,000 years. I mean, at what point do you think things will look deeply unfamiliar for us, even if our ancestors survived?
Well, I'll take up the question of whether we'll be around in 100 years, the one that the questioner raised. I think the attitude has to be, well, first, one thing we don't know for sure, but what we ought to do is to identify the risks as reasonably as possible and to map out ways of dealing with them. As I've said, I don't think that runaway artificial intelligence, either of the megalomaniacal variety or of the collateral damage variety, is an existential risk. And I think that all engineering raises risks that any responsible engineer would deal with as the technology is implemented. I do think that the risk of nuclear war is serious enough that we should pursue some of the policies that have already reduced the risk, such as, I didn't get to show a slide, but the world's nuclear arsenal has already been reduced by 85% since the height of the Cold War. There are, I think, reasonable roadmaps to bringing that down to zero, the global zero movement, advocated not by starry-eyed peaceniks and romantics, but by some of the most hard-headed Cold War hawks like Henry Kissinger and Sam Nunn, George Shultz, William Perry, who explicitly called for a pathway to zero. Barack Obama mentioned it in a famous speech, and that's one of the reasons he got the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, we've gone in the opposite direction with the rise of Putin and Donald Trump, but there's no reason to think that that is a permanent diversion from the goal, and we should resume it as rapidly as possible, together with making the systems that we do have as resilient and stable as possible, putting nuclear weapons on a long fuse, reducing the possibilities of false alarms, with a goal toward eliminating them altogether. Likewise, with climate change, there are pathways to decarbonizing the economy involving carbon pricing, involving the development of zero carbon technologies, eventually technologies that will suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, that we should pursue aggressively. And so I don't think that we should either resign ourselves to this being our final century, nor be heedless of the very real challenges that we face.
So I apologize, there's never a good time to cut this off, but I'm just going to take one more question because we have a book signing to do. Steve has written a wonderful book. Hold your applause until the actual end, but I'm getting you ready for it. He's written a book that has not been exhausted by our conversation, and that will be for sale in the lobby. And I will be sitting alongside him signing postcards. So if you have time after we finish here, please come up and say hi. But I want to take one question because I feel like you got shortchanged here.
For each of you, what is the most significant and strongly held belief you possessed that you subsequently changed your mind on?
It's a good question. Why did you have to make it so good at the end? Do you have a ready answer for that? Do you have what?
I think in the transition between the time I wrote The Blank Slate, which had a somewhat tragic view of the human condition because it argued for human nature with all of its flaws and shortcomings and self-centeredness and biases and so on, and the time that I wrote The Better Angels of Our Nature, when I became more aware of all of the areas of human improvement and developed a more optimistic view of the human condition. That I would identify as the main change in my overall view of the human condition.
I actually don't have a great answer for you. I've changed my position that was strongly held on various topics, like the death penalty. At one point I was for it, and now I'm strongly against it. And that was just a very simple process of reasoning myself out of it. It relates to my beliefs about free will and related matters. Actually, AI was another change for me that came a couple of years ago. I thought I would have, probably 2 years ago, I would have agreed very much with Steve that this is just a cockamamie fantasy, that people are, there's basically nothing that should inform our thinking from a thought experiment like Nick Bostrom's paperclip maximizer. But now I'm convinced that it actually is a legitimate worry and it's possible to do badly. So yeah, I mean, I should say I find it very satisfying to have sweeping changes like that, and they don't come often enough. I mean, I'm sure there are many things that we're all wrong about that we hold very close, and it's people. We act as though we want to resist those moments where we're being dragged into a new point of view, and we live much of our lives are predicated on at least intellectually on resisting those moments. But it is a relief to finally be dragged to a new position that seems better. I mean, I think it really is thrilling. So. Before I go, I just want to thank Steve for being the inaugural guest of this event. Thank you. And I'll say we'll be back in 2 months. Antonio Damasio, a very brilliant neuroscientist, has written a book about the brain and culture, and we will be moving to the theater at the Ace Hotel in 2 months, and I hope to see all of you there, or actually half of you there, because it's just a smaller room. That's happening there. And again, Steve, thank you for joining me. This is really an honor. Yeah.